Welcome back. Last week, I began reading you an excerpt from The Adventures of Roderick Ransom by Tobias Smollett. It began with our protagonist being set upon by a Royal Navy press gang and held in conditions of abject squalor and misery on board a pressing tender. From there, he is transferred to the warship Thunder, where he makes the acquaintance of an honest tar by the name of Jack Ratlin. Unfortunately, over the course of his many tribulations, and through no fault of his own, young Ransom falls afoul of a tyrannical midshipman, and is used most barbarously by him. By a stroke of good fortune, the surgeon's mate who tends to Ransom's wounds is an old friend, and so egregious is the midshipman's abuse that he goes at once to the first lieutenant, who agrees to hear Ransom's case. It is here that we rejoin our hero. I recounted the particulars of his behavior to me, not only in the tender, but since my being on board the ship, part of which being proved by the evidence of Jack Ratlin and others, who had no great devotion for my oppressor. I was discharged from confinement to make way for him, who was delivered to the master-at-arms to take his turn in the bilboes. This was not the only satisfaction I enjoyed, for I was, at the request of the surgeon, exempted from all other duty than that of assisting his mates in making and administering medicines to the sick. This good office I owed to the friendship of Mr. Thompson, who had represented me in such a favorable light to the surgeon that he demanded me of the lieutenant to supply the place of his third mate, who was lately dead. When I had obtained this favor, my friend Thompson carried me down to the cockpit, which was a little place allotted for the habitation of the surgeon's mates, and when he had shown me their berths, as he called it, I was filled with astonishment and horror. We descended by diverse ladders to a deck as dark as a dungeon, which I understood was immersed several feet under the water, being immediately above the hold. I had no sooner approached this dismal gulf than my nose was saluted with an intolerable stench of putrefied cheese and rancid butter that issued from the apartment at the foot of the ladder, resembling a chandler's shop, where, by the faint glimmering of a candle, I could perceive a man with pale, meager countenance sitting behind a kind of desk, having spectacles on his nose and a pen in his hand. This, I learned of Mr. Thompson, was the ship's steward, who sat there to distribute provisions to the several messes and to mark what each received. He therefore presented my name to him and desired that I might be entered in his mess. Then, taking a light in his hand, he conducted me to the place of his residence, which was a square of about 6 feet, surrounded with the medicine chest, that of the first mate, his own, and a board by way of a table fastened to the after powder room. It was also enclosed with canvas, nailed round to the beams of the ship to screen us from the cold, as well as from the view of the midshipman and the quartermaster, who lodged within the cable tiers on either side of us. In this gloomy mansion he entertained me with some cold soup pork, which he brought from a sort of locker fixed above the table, and, calling for the boy of the mess, sent for a can of beer, of which he made an excellent flip to crown the banquet. By this time, I began to recover my spirits, which had been exceedingly depressed with the appearance of everything about me, and could no longer refrain from asking the particulars of Mr. Thompson's fortune, since I had last seen him in London. He told me that being disappointed in his expectations of borrowing money to gratify a rapacious fellow at the Navy Office, he found himself utterly unable to subsist any longer in town, and had actually offered his service in quality of mate to the surgeon of a merchant ship bound for Guinea in the slaving trade. Well, one morning, a young fellow of whom he had some acquaintance came to his lodgings and informed him that he had seen a warrant made out in his name at the Navy Office for surgeon's second mate of a third rate. This unexpected piece of good news he could scarcely believe to be true, more especially as he had been found qualified at the surgeon's hall for third mate only. But that he might not be wanting to himself, he went thither to be assured, and actually found it so, whereupon, demanding his warrant, it was delivered to him, and the oaths administered immediately. That very afternoon he went to Gravesend in a tilt boat, from whence he took his place in a tide coach for Rochester. Next morning, got on board the Thunder, for which he was appointed, then lying at harbor at Chatham, and the same day was mustered by the clerk of the check. Well it was for him that such expedition was used, for, in less than 12 hours after his arrival, another William Thompson came on board, affirming that he was the person for whom the warrant was expedited, and the other was an impostor. My friend was grievously alarmed at this incident, and the more so, as his namesake had very much the advantage over him, both in assurance and dress. However, to acquit himself of the suspicion of imposture, he produced several letters written from Scotland to him in that name, and, recollecting that his indentures were in a box on board, he brought them up, and convinced all present that he had not assumed a name which did not belong to him. His competitor, enraged that they should hesitate in doing him justice, for to be sure, the warrant had been designed for him, behaved with so much indecent heat that the commanding officer, who was the same gentleman that I had seen, and the surgeon were offended at his presumption, and making a point of it with their friends in town, in less than a week got the first confirmed in his station. I have been on board, he said, ever since, and, as this way of life is becoming familiar to me, have no cause to complain of my situation. The surgeon is a good-natured, indolent man. The first mate, who is now on shore on duty, is indeed a little proud and choleric, as all Welshmen are, but in the main a friendly, honest fellow. The lieutenants I have no concern with, and as far as the captain, he is too much of a gentleman to know a surgeon's mate, even by sight. After dinner, Thompson led me round the ship, showed me the different parts, described their uses, and, as far as he could, made me acquainted with the particulars of the discipline and economy practiced on board. He then demanded of the boatswain a hammock for me, which was slung in a very neat manner by my friend Jack Rattlin, and, as I had no bedclothes, procured credit for me from the purser for a mattress and 2 blankets. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Morgan, the surgeon, visited the sick, and, having ordered what was proper for each, I assisted Thompson in making up his prescriptions. But when I followed him with the medicines into the sick berth, or hospital, and observed the situation of the patients, I was much less surprised to see that people should die on board than that a sick person should ever recover. Here I saw about 50 miserable and distempered wretches, suspended in rows, so huddled one upon another that no more than 14 inches of space was allotted for each man with his bed and bedding, and deprived of the light of day, as well as of fresh air, breathing nothing but a noisome atmosphere of the morbid steams exhaling from their own excrements and diseased bodies, devoured with the vermin hatched in that filth that surrounded them, and destitute of every convenience necessary for people in that helpless condition. I could not comprehend how it was possible for the attendants to come near those who hung toward the sides of the ship in order to assist them, as they seemed barricadoed by those who lay on the outside, and entirely out of reach of all visitation. Much less could I conceive how my friend Thompson would be able to administer clysters that were ordered for some in that situation. Then I saw him thrust his wig in his pocket, strip himself to the waistcoat in a moment, and creep on all fours under the hammocks of the sick, and, forcing up his bare pate between two, keep them asunder with one shoulder, until he had done his duty. Eager to learn the service, I desired he would give me leave to perform the next operation of that kind, and he consenting, I undressed myself after his example, and, crawling along, the ship happened to roll. This motion alarming me, I laid hold of the first thing that came within my grasp with such violence that I overturned it, and soon found, by the smell that issued upon me, that I had unlocked a box of the most delicious perfume. It was well for me that my nose was none of the most delicate, else I know not how I might have been affected by this vapor, which diffused itself all over the ship, to the utter discomposure of everybody who tarried on the same dock. Neither was the consequence of this disgrace confined to my sense of smelling only, for I felt my misfortune in more ways than one. That I might not, however, appear altogether disconcerted in this my first essay, I got up, and pushing my head with great force between 2 hammocks toward the middle, where the greatest resistance was, I made an opening indeed, but, not understanding the knack of dexterously turning my shoulder to maintain my advantage, had the mortification to find myself stuck up, as it were, in a pillory, and the weight of 3 or 4 people bearing down on either side of my neck, so that I was in danger of strangulation. While I remained in this defenseless posture, one of the sick men, rendered peevish by his distemper, was so enraged at the smell I had occasioned, and the rude shock which he had received from me in my elevation, that, with many bitter reproaches, he seized me by the nose, which he tweaked so unmercifully that I roared with anguish. Thompson, perceiving my condition, ordered one of the waiters to my assistance, who, with much difficulty, disengaged me from this situation, and hindered me from taking vengeance upon the sick man, whose indisposition would not have screened him from the effects of my indignation. Having made an end of our ministry for that time, we descended to the cockpit, and I cleaned myself as soon as possible, and dressed myself for supper. Well, it seems young Ransom still has much to learn about shipboard life. It is close quarters indeed, and, alas, the sick are afforded no more space than the able-bodied. In the Royal Navy, that means 14 inches in which to sling a hammock. Here in America, things are far more humane, with every man allowed an entire 18 inches in which to sleep. Truly the fruits of democracy. Next week, I shall return with the third and final part of our little trilogy. Until next week then, shipmates, farewell.